late or later today. Well, I'm not going to take a long time introducing James Cummins, because I suppose you all know who he is: speaks, counts, underlying proficiency, etc. So we had the opportunity to have Dr. Cummins in the year 2010 in the first international conference, and today we are honored to have him again in CIEB 2019. Today we have the good fortune to enjoy Dr. Jim Cummins' session, Emerging Issues in Bilingual Education, the Roles of Literacy, Engagement, Cross-Linguistic Pedagogy and Identity Text in Students' Achievement. Dr. Cummins has been one of the leading advocates for bilingualism and bilingual education for nearly 3 decades. He's a professor emeritus at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto and an adjunct professor at, I don't know how to pronounce this, University in Finland.
It used to be.
Used to be Abo Academy.
Yeah.
So his research focuses on literacy development in educational contexts characterized by linguistic diversity. In numerous articles and books, he has explored the outcomes of bilingual education and second language immersion programs for both linguistic minority and majority students. Dr. Cummins, the floor is yours.
Let me thank Virginia and her colleagues on the organizing committee for this conference for the opportunity to be here in this amazing city, which throughout its history has involved cultural contact and multilingualism, but also to be here as part of this conference. As Virginia mentioned, I was at the 2010 conference in Madrid, and the energy of that conference has stayed with me since, and so I look forward to renewing that energy by the opportunity to be here with you for several days. I remember the statistics that amazed me when I went to the Madrid context, because I think they started off with 25 schools involved in bilingual education, I think 5 or 6 years previously. And at that point in 2010 it had got up to 250 schools and has expanded since then. And obviously bilingual programs have expanded throughout the country. And so the energy that this movement incorporates is really impressive. Let me, before getting into some of the issues that I want to talk about, I'd like to highlight something that was said by the participants in the early panel, namely that when we have a spread like this, it's very rapid, an expansion of bilingual programs, obviously issues of quality become important. How do we ensure that teachers have the knowledge to understand what they're doing when they're teaching in a bilingual context? What kinds of instructional strategies are going to work best? And those are the issues that I want to talk about in my presentation. I'm going to pick up on the themes of the conference, language, bilingualism and bilingual education, and look at what we know from the research about those issues, and then look at what that research implies for what we do in the classroom. But first, let me give you a little bit of background about myself and my own experience in bilingual education and my own experience in terms of context that I've worked in. As you can probably infer from the diagram, the map on the left, I grew up in Ireland. The deviant phonemes in English that are bouncing off the walls originated in Dublin. And my first experience of bilingual education was in an Irish English program, or a Gael Skull, as we call it in Ireland, where Irish, as most of you I'm sure know, is one of the 2 official languages of Ireland. English is the other. Obviously everybody speaks English, but attempts to revive the Irish language since the early 1920s have been mixed in terms of their effectiveness. And I experienced both major methods of trying to teach Irish. In my initial experiences in school, in what we call kindergarten or infant school in Ireland, Irish was taught as a subject. But then when I was about 6 years old, my parents sent me to a Gaelscoil, a school where 80% of the instruction was through Irish and 20% through English. They didn't send me there because they were fervent advocates for the revival of Irish. It just happened to be the closest school to the one my brother was going to. And so we could go on the bus together, and he would go right up to one school, I would go left to the other. And then the following year, I was due to go to the same school as he was. But I can remember not understanding very much initially in terms of what was taught through Irish. But then gradually, somehow, the language got internalized. And I can remember speaking Irish in the bus, coming home with friends. It was an example of what a colleague of mine in Toronto, Meryl Swain, called bilingualism without tears. The tears came later, the following year, when I went to the school that my brother was going to, which was much more typical in that it taught Irish as a subject for about 45 minutes every day. English was the normal language of communication. And English was virtually the only language that one heard on the streets of Dublin. Irish was not a language that was in common use. And I think they must have researched all of the methods of teaching second languages that had proven themselves to be irredeemably ineffective since the beginnings of history, because they taught vocabulary out of context. They marked all the errors that we made in things that we wrote in Irish. There was no real audience, there was no real motivation for using the language. And I spent the next 10 years losing most of the fluency that I'd got in that first year in the immersion program, the bilingual program. The best description that I've heard of what those classes were like was that they were like grammar and syntax crisis centers, where the focus was just on teaching the structure of the language rather than teaching communication in the language. I did well in examinations in Irish, but I was much more fluent at the age of 8 than I was at the age of 18. And that experience has stayed with me, and I'll talk more about some of the implications of that later. I did a degree in psychology in Dublin, and then a one-year postgraduate diploma, and then I went to Canada to do graduate work. And I spent 5 frozen years of my life out in Edmonton in Alberta, which is the most northerly of the big Canadian cities. And when I went out there in the early 70s, I was surprised to find that everybody in education, or at least in language education, was very excited about these new programs called French immersion programs that had been started in the Montreal area in the early to mid-60s and had been evaluated as being very successful, and now are spreading across the country very rapidly. And I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation in a French-English bilingual program that had both native French speakers and English speakers in the program. And then I went back to Ireland for 2 years, did some more work on Irish-English bilingualism, then went back to Canada. So my experience spans both sides of the Atlantic. I have one foot on either side. And I've been able to benefit from the research that has gone on both in North America as well as in Europe. Let me just go through some of the major points that I want to make, just to give some structure to what I'm going to say. So the first point I want to make is that in order to implement evidence-based policies and evidence-based pedagogical practices, we need to understand what the research is saying about language, bilingualism, and bilingual education. So in other words, evidence is important. Facts matter, despite what Mr. Trump might say. But because what we're talking about are children's lives. If we implement instructional practices that have no basis in evidence, children will not learn the way we want them to. The research is very clear on many points, but one of the points that it's unambiguous about is that using a target language as a language of instruction or as a medium of instruction is much more effective than teaching it only as a school subject. And this, as I said, is what I experienced in growing up in Dublin. However, simply using the target language or languages as language of instruction is not sufficient by itself. We also need to implement effective multilingual or plurilingual pedagogies. And so we come back to this issue of, what is quality education in a bilingual context? And The points that I want to make in terms of instructional quality are that effective pedagogies will involve teaching for conceptual and linguistic transfer across languages. So we know from a lot of bilingual programs that there will be spontaneous transfer of knowledge across languages. And we're talking here about both concepts and vocabulary and other aspects of language. But if we teach actively to encourage that two-way transfer, students are going to develop much more awareness of how the language works, and the program will be more successful. And one of the reasons for stressing this is because many of the bilingual programs that have been implemented in Canada and in the United States have operated on the assumption that the two languages should be kept fairly rigidly separate, and that we shouldn't confuse children by mixing the languages or by teaching, or by the teacher using two languages in the same period or lesson. I think there's some validity to creating separate spaces for each language, but we also need to bring those languages together into productive contact. So another aspect in terms of quality pedagogy is that effective pedagogy will involve reinforcing language knowledge and awareness right across the curriculum. So it's not just the job of the language teacher. If we're talking about a multilingual context that might be monolingual in its instruction, but we have many students from many different language backgrounds in those classes. Many of them are learning English as an English or Spanish as an additional language, which is typical in countries like Canada and Spain that have experienced considerable immigration. We need to focus on reinforcing students' knowledge of language when we're teaching science, when we're teaching mathematics, when we're teaching social studies. It's not just an issue for the language teacher or the language specialist to do. Another aspect that I want to emphasize is that reading and writing are important. Okay? That may seem like an obvious statement, but often when we're teaching in a bilingual program, we don't really understand just how critical it is to get students actively engaged with reading, and I would add actively engaged with writing. And this comes back to what I'll talk about in terms of the nature of language proficiency, where the language that we use in everyday conversational interactions it involves much more high-frequency words, much more everyday grammatical constructions. But if we want students to expand their language into more literate areas and to be able to do a lot of more complex things with language, they find that language in two places. They find it in classrooms and they find it in printed texts. So if students are not reading extensively in the target language as well as in their first language, then they're not going to expand their proficiency nearly as much as we would like. A fourth point is that effective pedagogy will involve enabling students to do powerful things with their languages. Now, by powerful things, I mean doing academic work that will affirm their identities. And I'll elaborate on that as we go through. And then the final point, which I'm not going to talk very much about, but it's something that is important from an administrative point of view, is that if the whole school is on the same wavelength in terms of what our goals are, in terms of how we reinforce students' bilingual proficiencies, if the school principal, the head teachers in the schools are aware of what makes for effective bilingual pedagogies, results are going to be better than if it's just the bilingual teacher herself or himself doing it. So those are some of the major practical points that I want to make. So the first segment, or first part of what I want to say is concerns the knowledge base. What is the research saying? So the first point I want to make is that the nature of language proficiency needs to be taken into account. Specifically, we need to take account of the distinction between language use in an everyday conversational setting and the kinds of language demands that students will encounter in school, and the kinds of language proficiencies that they will have to develop if they want to continue their education, if they want to go to third level education, if they want to find a job where they have to use the target language. They will need to expand their language proficiency far beyond just everyday conversational contexts. The second point concerns the nature of bilingual or multilingual proficiency. Specifically, the reality and the implications of the interdependence across languages. The fact that languages are not separate from each other, there's a lot of overlap and interdependence across languages. And this is the basis, this is what makes for the possibility of transfer of knowledge and skills and concepts across languages. And the third point is, what do we know about bilingual education? How is it that we can spend, let's say, 50% of the time in a Spanish context through English and 50% through Spanish, and the students still do as well in Spanish as students who've had 100% of their time through Spanish? How is it that there isn't a direct relationship between the time spent through two languages and the outcomes? Students seem to be able to do as well with half the instructional time as with 100% of the instructional time. So we need to understand what the research is saying about bilingual education, how it works in different contexts, and what makes for quality bilingual education. So I'll get into those issues in a moment. But the second segment comes back to some of the things I said earlier on. First of all, we need to understand why it is that literacy engagement is crucial, and the fact that there is a huge amount of research that has been largely ignored. In the United States, it's been very much ignored in terms of not just bilingual programs, but monolingual programs. And as I said, we find language only in two places: classrooms and printed texts. So if we want students to develop knowledge of, or to expand their knowledge, reading and writing is crucial. Secondly, we need to look at cross-linguistic pedagogies. And the argument that is that we need to teach for active transfer of concepts and skills across languages. And so this is controversial in many contexts. For example, in the Canadian context, when words like translanguaging are introduced, and when researchers and others argue that we don't need to keep the languages totally separate. We don't need to create a totally isolated space for each language. Teachers get very concerned and worried about this because they have been told for 40 years that they have to keep the languages separate. So there's a change happening in our understanding of what makes for effective bilingual pedagogy. And the third part that I want to highlight is a term that's used in the title of my presentation: identity text. And text here has been used in a broad sense. It's not just written text. But these are, what we're talking about here, are products that students produce through their academic work. They invest their identities in creating things that they're proud of. It might be a dual language book where both Spanish and English are in the book. It might be a multilingual book. It might be a science project where they use multiple languages. It could be any number of things. It could be a video that they produce. But the artifacts that students create when they're doing powerful things with language hold a mirror up to students in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And this affirmation of identity fuels further engagement with literacy, language learning, and cognitive work. So the 3 points that I want to make in terms of injecting aspects of quality into bilingual instruction go beyond just professional development for teachers, go beyond just organizational issues. We're talking about pedagogical practices that relate directly to what the research is saying. We need to engage students actively with literacy in both their languages. We need to teach for transfer and language awareness across languages. And we need to enable students to do powerful things with their languages if they're going to identify and take ownership of the languages. So that's the overview. Anybody who's got urgent things to do tonight can go, because this is basically the point that I'm going to make. But I'll elaborate on it as clearly as I can. So going back to the first segment, the nature of language proficiency. Here are some of the differences between conversational fluency and what I and other people call academic language proficiency. So when we're talking about conversational fluency, we're talking about the kind of language we use in everyday face-to-face situations. In face-to-face situations, there's all kinds of clues to the meaning in addition to just the language itself. Some of us will wave our hands around. There are gestures, there are facial expressions, there's tone of voice. all of these things communicate meaning in addition to the language. We're talking about the kind of language that the vast majority of that what children bring to school is only a thin slice of the kind of language proficiency that we're going to try and develop in them during the 12 years or so that they're in school. Because we're talking about the use of high-frequency words and relatively straightforward, simple grammatical constructions. You don't find too many people in any culture that use the subjunctive in everyday conversation. And so when we look at immigrant background students who are learning the school language, generally when they're in a context where they have exposure to the language, on the playground, in the classroom, on television, usually within about a year or 2 years, they've developed a good degree of comfort with the language. Now this is very different than the kind of language that we try to teach students in school and that they need to learn if they're going to succeed in school. Every language test, as students go up to grade levels, will get at these aspects. So we're talking about knowledge of the less frequent vocabulary in a language, as well as the ability to comprehend or interpret and produce increasingly complex written language. We're talking about vocabulary that is low frequency, and as well as use of grammatical constructions that are very different from those we typically use in everyday conversation. So in English, for example, we'll use the passive voice very frequently in science texts or other texts. We'll use structures like nominalization, where we create a noun, an abstract noun, out of a verb or sometimes an adjective, like accelerate, acceleration. And we rarely use these terms in conversation, but they're crucial in disciplinary areas like science, mathematics, and social studies. And then the point that I'll emphasize again, because academic language is found primarily in books and printed text, extensive reading is crucial in enabling students to catch up. So if we look at some of the, one example of this, these are some of the words I pulled out of a grade 5 social studies unit in an American textbook. It was a unit on the American Revolution. So think about the last time that you use words like amend or inference or preamble when you're talking to your friends. If you did use these words a lot, you probably don't have very many friends. If you want to get kicked off Facebook, defriended, use this language, okay? One characteristic in English of the academic language we use is that the vocabulary comes primarily from Latin and Greek sources. An implication of that is that there are lots of cognates with languages like Spanish. The language that we use in English in everyday context comes primarily from Anglo-Saxon sources. And this goes back to the history of the English language in terms of the language that was used roughly between 500 and 1000 or 1100 AD was an Anglo-Saxon language that came from Northern Europe. Then the Normans invaded from France in 1066, and they brought their language with them, which was based on Old French and was Latin and Greek based. And so the two languages merged to give us what we now call English. But this is fascinating. They didn't merge evenly across all domains and functions of the language. The Anglo-Saxon language that was there originally remained a language of everyday interaction. It was the language of the peasants, of people who didn't have the opportunity to be educated. But the Latin-based language that the Normans brought in was the language of the dominant class, the ruling class. It was the language of the legal system. It was obviously the language of the church long before that. And so that distinction is still with us in that higher status functions of the language, more formal functions, tend to draw on the Latin and Greek-based lexicon much more than everyday functions do. Just looking at one of the implications of this in terms of developing language proficiency among immigrant background students, these are data that go back quite a long way. I was able to reanalyze data from the Toronto Board of Education shortly after I settled in Toronto. And LOR here stands for length of residence, AOA is age on arrival, and down in the vertical axis you're looking at standard deviation units. So minus 15 there would be the equivalent of 15 points below the mean on, say, a typical IQ test or standard score. what you're looking at here is that students who have been in Canada for 1 year, who were born outside of Canada and were learning English as an additional language, are about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. After 3 years, they come up to 1 standard deviation below, so the equivalent of about 15 points. But it's roughly between 5 and 7 years before they're getting close to grade norms in academic language proficiency. And there are 2 reasons for this. One is related to the complexity of academic language and the fact that we gain access to it in restricted contexts, in classrooms and in printed text. But secondly, students who are immigrating, who are learning the language as an additional language, are trying to catch up to a moving target. Because native speakers of the language are not just standing still, waiting for second language learners to catch up with them. Every year, native speakers are expanding their reading skills, they're expanding their vocabulary knowledge, they're expanding their writing skills. So immigrant background students have to run faster in order to catch up. And I think these data sort of illustrate just the importance of understanding this distinction between conversational and academic language proficiency. Because in the past, many teachers and psychologists would think when they interview a child who might not be doing well, might be struggling in school, well, they speak English fluently, so English is not the problem. He or she must have some kind of learning handicap. In actual fact, it may just be the normal process of catching up academically, which takes much longer typically than the process of gaining a reasonable degree of fluency in the language. Okay, so that's the distinction between conversational and academic language proficiency. As I said, it has major implications for what we do in schools. It means that if we're talking about immigrant background students, it can't be just the language specialist teacher, the Spanish as a second language or an additional language teacher who's trying to help students catch up. It has to be something that happens right across the curriculum. And we can talk more about that later. But if we move on to the second segment, what do we know about bilingualism and multilingualism? So the research has consistently shown that reading skills and writing skills are relatively strongly related across languages. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I've quoted here the conclusion of a major research review in the United States that came out in 2006 that talks about the fact that in multiple spheres we find these connections across languages. That students who are doing well in one language will tend to do well academically in the other language also. And this relationship increases as students go up the grade levels. So if we look at, say, the relationship between English and Spanish in kindergarten, we may not find a strong correlation. But as you go up the grade levels, that correlation will increase dramatically, because what we're talking about is correlation of academic knowledge across languages. There was a study done quite a while ago, back in 1985, by 2 researchers in the United States, and they showed that the relationships between Spanish and English in a bilingual program involving students of Puerto Rican background increased between kindergarten, so age 5, and 3rd grade. It went from 0 to 0.68. So as we go up the grade levels, this relationship becomes stronger. And many of you may have seen this diagram. It's a visual metaphor that tries to express what the research is saying. And basically what it's saying is that different languages don't occupy separate spaces in our brains. There's overlap and interdependence amongst them, and that's what the correlations are showing. So that even though the surface features of 2 languages may be different, and Spanish and English obviously have much more in common with each other than, say, either one has with Chinese, but there's still differences. But at a deeper level, at the level of concepts, at the level of cognitive functioning with language, there's a lot of overlap or interdependence. So I talk about the common underlying proficiency that makes possible transfer across languages. There's an interesting, another visual metaphor that was put forward by a New Zealand educator, a person called Sophie Tawea-Tamati, whose dissertation was written in 2016 involving Maori and English. And she uses the analogy of a particular tree that you find in New Zealand called the kahikatea tree. And this tree it grows in fairly swampy areas, and the roots spread out and intermingle amongst each other, so the roots become intertwined. And that generates a lot more strength for each tree than it would have if it was standing independently. And so this is kind of similar to the common underlying proficiency, even though we don't notice the roots that often because they're below the ground for the most part. We notice the trees standing up individually. So we can talk about languages. Languages exist, and I say that because some people have argued recently that languages don't really exist. So languages exist, but they're intertwined, they're connected at a deeper conceptual level. These are some of the types of cross-lingual transfer that occur. I'm not going to go into detail because of time, and I assume that you will get access to the PowerPoint at some point. I'll make it available so it could be put onto a web page. But we're talking about concepts, we're talking about specific linguistic elements, phonological awareness transfers across languages. There's quite a bit of research that morphology awareness transfers, linguistic strategies transfer. So it's not just cognate relationships we're talking about. We're talking about multiple aspects of academic language proficiency can transfer. Okay, what does the research say about bilingual education? So first point to note is that bilingual programs are not new. They existed in Greek and Roman times. And they generally, as I said, produce much better outcomes in the target language than teaching the language as a subject. And they do this at no cost to students' knowledge of their home language or the dominant language. Something that is important to emphasize, and an American researcher, Lily Wong Fillmore, has emphasized this for many, many years, that minority languages are fragile. Like without strong support in the school and community, students will often not develop strong fluency and literacy in their home language. And this has implications for all of us as educators in a context where population mobility is probably at an all-time high. So there are many students from different language backgrounds in our schools, and what we see very often, certainly in a Canadian context, is that students may come to school fluent in their home language, possibly bilingual in that home language and in the school language, and within a couple of years they're losing their fluency in their home language, they're refusing to speak it at home, and they leave school with much less knowledge of, much less fluency in their home language than they had when they started school. And that is something that concerns us as educators, because if we define our role as educators as making students more than they were, then I think we have to focus on encouraging students to maintain that language, communicating to them that their home languages are important. They are a part of becoming bilingual, multilingual, which has always been a characteristic of educated people. And we need to communicate that actively to students, because all of the other messages they're getting in the society is that they're not welcome, their languages are not welcome in many contexts. And if the school is reinforcing that unwelcoming message, then I think it's really problematic from an educational point of view. So this is the point I made before. There's no loss, no adverse effects in terms of students' knowledge of the majority language. But the final point I want to make is that academic skills in both languages must be actively taught. Transfer doesn't happen automatically. As I said, some transfer will, but it'll happen much more effectively if we teach for transfer. Okay, here's a conclusion from a recent comprehensive review of the research on students who are learning English as an additional language in the United States. It's put together by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, and that sounds like a fairly imposing title, and it is. They bring together committees of about 20 people to synthesize all of the research. They argue about what the research is saying. So anything that comes out from groups like this has a lot of credibility. And this is what they concluded about the efficacy of bilingual education. And they're talking here about students from minority language backgrounds. So they say the syntheses of evaluation studies that compare outcomes for English learners instructed in English-only programs with outcomes for English learners instructed bilingually find either that there's no difference in outcomes measured in English, or that English learners in bilingual programs outperform English learners instructed only in English. So despite having much less time through English, they're doing better in English. And that's coming out from some of the more recent large-scale studies. And they mentioned that there are 2 recent studies that followed students for sufficient time to gauge longer-term effects of language instruction on English learner outcomes, find benefits for bilingual compared to English-only approaches. So we're looking at a context where, whether we're talking about students from the dominant language groups, say Spanish speakers in Spain, or students from minority backgrounds, bilingual programs have demonstrated their effectiveness. Obviously, they have to be well implemented, so quality is important. But anybody who argues that students will suffer in a bilingual program has not read the research, and they should be told, here's where you can find what the research is saying, come back, get yourself educated, and then we can talk about what the research means. Because the research is unambiguous in terms of the legitimacy of bilingual programs for both students from minority backgrounds as well as majority backgrounds. Okay, the third point in terms of what the research is saying, moving on to the second segment in terms of instructional implications. The central role of literacy engagement. I've put on the screen the cover of a book written by Steve Krashen, a very well-known American researcher who's been working in this area for a long time. This is the second edition of a book that he wrote. This came out in about 2004, I think. The first edition was in the 90s. And Steve brought together a lot of the research that showed that reading was a powerful way of expanding students' proficiency, both in their first language as well as in their second language. And the logic here is very transparent. And this is about the 4th time I've said this, so you should all be ready for the test that will come after this presentation. But it's basically, we find academic language primarily in text rather than in everyday conversation. And so students' opportunities to broaden their vocabulary knowledge and develop strong reading comprehension skills are likely to be greatly enhanced when they have abundant access to printed texts and engage actively with these texts. What this means is that school libraries are important. If we're talking about students who are growing up without a lot of family resources, who are growing up in poverty, we need to find a way to get books into their hands. Ideally, schools will have libraries where they can give students books to bring home to read to their parents. We have to get students engaged actively in reading in both languages if we want to get optimal outcomes. Some of the data, there's a lot of data relating to this. I'm just going to show you a glimpse of some of the findings that come out of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's PISA studies. PISA stands for Program for International Student Assessment. And they have found consistently that the level of a student's reading engagement is a better predictor of literacy performance than his or her socioeconomic background, indicating that cultivating a student's interest in reading can help overcome home disadvantages. They find consistent relationships between reading engagement and reading performance. They're talking here about performance in the dominant language, but the same pattern emerges with second languages. And one of the fascinating findings from the OECD work is the finding that there's about a 1/3 overlap between the negative effects of social disadvantage and the positive effects of reading engagement. So what that means is that schools could significantly reduce, they could push back about 30% of the negative effects of low socioeconomic status by actively promoting literacy engagement. This is a huge potential impact. And yet, again, in many contexts, teachers have not heard about how strong an effect this has. In the United States, for example, there has been a concerted effort to focus only on teaching phonics rules and literacy engagement, getting books into students' hands, creating a culture of reading and writing in the school has been very much neglected, which is one of the reasons why many schools in the United States are not doing well on programs like the PISA studies. Okay, second point, cross-linguistic pedagogy. I'm using this term rather than translanguaging. Translanguaging has become a very kind of hip term in the last 10 years or so, but there's confusion about what it means and to the side. But all of these, no matter what we call it, a common thread in all of these orientations is a rejection of the notion that we should keep the two languages rigidly separate, what I've called the two solitudes orientation, and a commitment to teaching for cross-linguistic transfer. And an advantage of this focus is that we're talking not just about bilingual programs where two languages of instruction are used. We're talking about mainstream programs that might have students from a variety of language backgrounds in their classes. And there's been a lot of work done in places like Canada and Ireland and other parts of Europe and the States, showing how teachers can bring in students' home languages in a really powerful way into the classroom. I'll give you one example of that in a few minutes. But if we go back to what I said earlier on about French immersion programs in Canada being wedded to the two solitudes orientation, this comes from Wally Lambert's. Wallace Lambert was the major researcher who evaluated the initial French immersion programs in Canada. And he formulated this monolingual instructional principle as follows. He says, no bilingual skills are required of the teacher who plays the role of a monolingual in the target language and who never switches languages, reviews materials in the other language, or otherwise uses the child's native language in teacher-pupil interactions. In immersion programs, therefore, bilingualism is developed through two separate monolingual instructional routes. Now, by immersion programs, he's talking about French-English bilingual programs, but there's an initial immersion in French, but they become 50-50 programs after a couple of years. But this has become dogma in the Canadian context, and it's a dogma that is hard to shift because teachers have been told that this is what the research is saying. There is, in fact, absolutely no research backing this up. It's purely picked out of the air. And there's a lot of things that are problematic about it. So it's led to restrictive pedagogical possibilities with very little opportunity for students to showcase their growing intellectual and literacy skills in the two languages. Because the two languages are kept in isolation from each other, teachers don't point to relationships between the two languages. For example, cognates across languages. They don't encourage students to write dual language books that could showcase their growing literacy in the two languages, or carry out projects in the two languages, because that would involve translation, and translation is something that you should never do according to this orientation. And they generally don't promote students' awareness of how language works, because then that would involve comparing the two languages. And this is beginning to shift in the Canadian context. And recently, French immersion researchers and educators have begun to explore ways of bringing the two languages into productive contact, while at the same time holding on to the notion that there should be relatively separate spaces for each language. And let me give you an example of this from work that Roy Lister and colleagues of his did in the Montreal area. They were working in a school district that's kind of unusual because there were significant numbers of both French native speakers and English native speakers in the same program. It was called a French immersion program, but there was the two languages were very present in the school context. And Roy and his colleagues wanted to see if they could kind of develop some cooperation between the teachers, because up to that point, the French teachers who were teaching French and the teachers who were teaching English didn't really talk to each other, and there was no coordination of curriculum. So they fixed on a popular children's book series called The Magic Treehouse that was available in both English and French. And the French and English teachers each read one chapter every day, alternating languages. So, for example, on Monday, the French teacher might read chapter 1 in French, and then on Tuesday, the English teacher would read chapter 2 in English. Wednesday, the French teacher would read chapter 3 in French. So they'd alternate languages. And that would get students talking about the text, because on, say, day 2, when the English teacher was reading the story, chapter 2 in English, she would probably start off by asking the students, well, can you tell me what happened in chapter 1? And she's using English so that even though the students listened to chapter 1 in French, they would talk about it and tell the teacher what happened in chapter 1 in English. So the languages were being kind of cross-fertilized unconsciously on the part of students. So students had no problem with the language alternation and were extremely motivated by the project. So this is an example of how teachers working collaboratively with researchers can become knowledge generators. There's all kinds of scope for pedagogical innovation here, and I think this can be really powerful in a number of contexts. The last instructional orientation that I want to make is talk about identity texts. There's a book that a colleague of mine, Margaret Early, and I wrote or edited called Identity Texts, the collaborative creation of power in multilingual schools. And this notion refers to artifacts that students produce. They take ownership of these artifacts as a result of having invested their identities in them. And these artifacts can be written, spoken, visual, musical, dramatic, or combinations in multimodal form. And once they're produced, they hold a mirror up to the student in which his or her identity is reflected back in a positive light. They've done something that they're proud of, they've worked hard at it, and once it's out there, they get a lot of positive feedback from their peers, from the teacher, from their parents. Some of the work that students have produced has been put up on the school website. They've been read by thousands of people. And so there's a real positive sense of accomplishment in doing this work. And this fuels further engagement. So if students have got positive feedback on their writing, they'll want to write more. And if they're showcasing their knowledge of 2 languages, they'll want to do that even more and read more and write more in the 2 languages. So let me give you one example. This is one example amongst many that highlights just how powerful it can be when students are given opportunities to produce identity texts. This example also exemplifies literacy engagement in that students are writing in the 2 languages. The context was a grade 7 classroom, so students were about 13 years old. All of the students were from immigrant backgrounds. They were at varying stages in the learning of English. So it was a mainstream classroom, it wasn't a bilingual classroom. There were many languages in the classroom. The teacher was teaching social studies, and there was a unit on immigration. And as a final project, a culminating project in the unit, students were supposed to carry out something either individually or collaboratively that then they could present as part of their final grade. And so 3 students from Pakistani background asked the teacher if they could write a story based on their immigration experiences. And the teachers thought that was a great idea. And then they said, well, 2 of them had immigrated around about grade 4, so they'd been in Canada for about 3.5 years, Sulmana and Kanta, but Mediha had just arrived about a month prior to doing this project. And so they said, well, could we do it in both languages, in Urdu as well as in English? And that way Mediha could participate also. And we're writing it for younger students, many of whom are more fluent in Urdu than in English. So the teacher thought that was a great idea and encouraged them to do it. And this is an example of what it looks like in the 2 languages. And if you imagine Mediha in a typical classroom where only English was used, she's only been learning English for about a month. If she had a writing project to do, you might get 2 or 3 painful sentences out of her. But you would not get a 20-page story, beautifully illustrated, beautifully written in 2 languages. And so in the early stages of learning English, she becomes an author in English. If you had given her the English version of this story before she had written it, she would not have been able to read it. But after she had written it with her friends, she was able to read it. And how they did this was the students discussed what they were going to do initially in Urdu. They planned out what the structure of the story was going to be. They invented a composite character called Sonia that embodied experiences that all 3 of them had had. And then they wrote, once they figured out what was going to be in each page, what the illustrations were going to show, they wrote the first draft in English. and then discussed it with the teacher, provided them feedback. They made some revisions, and then they went from English to Urdu. They translated from English to Urdu and came up with the dual language text. So this involves translation, which again, as I mentioned, is something that in bilingual programs we've thought you should never translate. But translation in the context of producing something like this is powerful language use. Let me show you something that one of the students said when they presented with their teacher at a conference, a Teachers of English as a Second Language conference in Toronto.
Hi, we're going to start by introducing Kanta, who's going to tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, my name is Kanta. I'm from Pakistan. My first language was Punjabi, my second language was Urdu, and my third language was English. I came here in grade 4, and now I am in grade 9.
How did you feel writing the book in 2 languages, and how did you see it helping you or the others?
It helped me a lot, and using 2 languages helped us a lot to understand English better. And for Madiha, who was actually new here, and then like in Urdu, if you would write, you would say 3 words. In English, you would actually have to write 5 words. So then, if you're thinking Urdu, you would be only writing those 3 words, and then so those sentence structures didn't really make sense. But while we were doing it, it made a lot of sense to her. And then how it helped me, like it helped me that when I was here and when I came here in grade 4, like the teachers didn't know what I was capable. I was given a pack of crayons and coloring book and to get on coloring with it. And then after I felt like so bad about that, I am capable of doing much more than just doing that. Like I have my own inner skills to show the world than just coloring, and then I felt like those skills of me were important also. So when we started writing this book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring. And then, so that's how it helped me, and then it made me so proud of myself that I am actually capable of doing something, and here today I am doing something like that, that I can actually show the world that I'm just not a coloring person. I can actually show you that I am something.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful statement about the centrality of identity to language learning and to success in school. And if we can provide opportunities in our bilingual programs to enable students to showcase what they're capable of, I think they're going to invest their identities in learning the language much more powerfully than if it's just something external, just an exam subject for them to pursue. Oops, sorry. So, as I said before, one of the things that we should look at is, what is our entire school, what's our whole school philosophy in relation to developing bilingualism and multilingualism? And this applies in mainstream programs as well as bilingual programs, because in countries like Spain and Canada and the United States, a large proportion of mainstream programs are going to have students who are in the process of learning the school language. So they're potentially bilingual, multilingual. So one way of starting discussion at the school level, or thinking about if we're involved in teacher training or professional development, is to ask, what's the image of the student that we're sketching in our instruction? So if we were to take a bird's eye view of all of the instruction going on in a school, like what kind of image is emerging of who the student is, what the student is capable of doing? And so, for example, if we have students who are learning the school language, only doing kind of memorization work in that language, only learning the grammar, only learning vocabulary, not doing work that is intellectually challenging and exciting, that's reflecting a certain image of the student in terms of what she or he is capable of. So we could ask questions like, to what extent is our instruction sketching an image of the student who's capable of becoming fluent and literate in multiple languages? Obviously in bilingual programs, that is an explicit image of the student. But we may have students in our bilingual programs who are speakers of Arabic, speakers of Romanian, speakers of other languages. Do we forget about those languages, or do we try to develop an inclusive orientation where we value those languages and celebrate those students' multilingualism while we're teaching the 2 main languages? Is the image of our student one where she or he is capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishment, capable of imaginative and creative thinking, capable of creating literature, drama and art? So if you take the case of Medina in the example of the Pakistani background students in Toronto, a student who's just in the early stages of learning English, who can't say very much in the language right now, can't write very much in the language. Typically, students like that have not been asked to do creative work in the language. They haven't been thought to be capable of creating literature in the language. And one of the reasons for that is that many classrooms teaching second language students in, say, English-speaking countries have been English-only zones. Students' first languages have not been thought capable of being brought into those classrooms. But if we get students to carry out work in their first language or write in their first language, and then we find a way to go from their first language to the second language, students are going to learn much more of the second language, they're going to feel accomplished, and they're going to feel confident that they can succeed, much more than if they're kept in a passive role in the classroom. Are students capable of generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? So all of these questions are ones that we can discuss amongst ourselves as teachers, as educators, and look at our own pedagogy and generate ideas for innovations that might apply to our particular context. We can learn from what's happened elsewhere. But when we look at the issues of innovation in contexts involving bilingual and multilingual students, despite the prominence of terms like translanguaging right now and theoretical concepts, the reality is that the innovations, our knowledge has come from teachers. Teachers have been the knowledge generators. And that dialogue between practice and theory and research in the middle of that is powerful. And so when we look at what can happen, we need to look at classrooms rather than research that takes place outside of classrooms. So let me conclude, just in terms of summarizing or synthesizing what I've said. I've suggested that we can look at three major pedagogical directions to maximize the potential of programs designed to promote students' bilingual and multilingual educational abilities. First of all, we should focus explicitly on enabling students to bring their languages into productive contact. We can talk amongst ourselves within schools as bilingual teachers how we do that. We can find innovations that work for our particular context. We can bring other languages that may be present in our classrooms into that dialogue. We need to maximize students' literacy engagement in all their languages. And again, if this is an entire school focus, it's going to work more effectively than if it's just one or two teachers doing it. And then finally, we need to enable students to use their languages for powerful intellectual and social purposes. And I've used the term identity text to highlight the central role of identity and identity investment and identity affirmation in promoting students' engagement with both of their languages. So thank you for listening, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Any questions you'd like to ask? Okay, we have good time for questions, so I know Spanish people love socializing, and that's what we are going to have now, having a coffee. As we have finished a bit later, so coffee will be until 6:15, and then all the workshops will start. Thank you very much for your attention.